Hi, everybody. Great to be with you. My name is Michael Millerman, millermanschool.com. Today, we are going over On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense by Nietzsche. So from time to time, as you know, we do article readings and essay readings on this channel. Yesterday's was a very long one, Leo Strauss's Progress and Return. Today, we have a shorter piece of writing, but still worth our attention, On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. Once upon a time, in some out-of-the-way corner of that universe, which is dispersed into numberless twinkling solar systems, there was a star upon which clever beasts invented knowing. That was the most arrogant and mendacious moment of world history, but nevertheless, it was only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star cooled and congealed, and the clever beasts had to die. One might invent such a fable, and yet he still would not have adequately illustrated how miserable, how shadowy and transient, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect looks within nature. There were eternities during which it did not exist, and when it is all over with the human intellect, nothing will have happened, for this intellect has no additional mission which would lead it beyond human life. Some of you may be familiar with the older idea that the human intellect is intimately related to the divine mind, to the divine intellect. So, for example, in Aristotle's On the Soul, you have a notion that was developed in later medieval philosophy and other philosophers of the active intellect, nous poetikos, of the idea that there is, you could say, a moment of connection between the human intellect and the divine intellect, pretty much rejected here. There were eternities during which it did not exist, and when it is all over with the human intellect, nothing will have happened, for this intellect has no additional mission which would lead it beyond human life. Rather, it is human, and only its possessor and begetter takes it so solemnly as though the world's axis turned within it. But if we could communicate with the gnat, we would learn that he likewise flies through the air with the same solemnity, that he feels the flying center of the universe within himself. There's nothing so reprehensible and unimportant in nature that it would not immediately swell up like a balloon at the slightest puff of this power of knowing. And just as every porter wants to have an admirer, so even the proudest of men, the philosopher, supposes that he sees on all sides the eyes of the universe telescopically focused on his action and thought. Okay, so the philosopher has this sort of prejudice as to the significance of the intellect. It's remarkable that this was brought about by the intellect, which was certainly allotted to these most unfortunate, delicate, and ephemeral beings merely as a device for detaining them a minute within existence. For without this addition, they would have every reason to flee this existence as quickly as Lessing's sun. The pride connected with knowing and sensing lies like a blinding fog over the eyes and senses of men, thus deceiving them concerning the value of existence. Okay, the pride connected with knowing deceives us concerning the value of existence. For this pride contains within itself the most flattering estimation of the value of knowing. You know, that to know is actually exalted and pure and a high act. Deception is the most general effect of such pride, but even its most particular effects contain within themselves something of the same deceitful character. As a means for preserving the individual, the intellect unfolds its principal powers in dissimulation, which is the means by which weaker, less robust individuals preserve themselves, since they have been denied the chance to wage the battle for existence with horns or with the sharp teeth of beasts of prey. This art of dissimulation reaches its peak in man. Deception, flattering, lying, deluding, talking behind the back, putting up a false front, living in borrowed splendor, wearing a mask, hiding behind convention, playing a role for others and for oneself. In short, a continuous fluttering around the solitary flame of vanity is so much the rule and the law among men that there's almost nothing which is less comprehensible than how an honest and pure drive for truth could have arisen among them. They're deeply immersed in illusions and in dream images. Their eyes merely glide over the surface of things and see quote-unquote forms. Their senses nowhere lead to truth. On the contrary, they're content to receive stimuli and, as it were, to engage in a groping game on the backs of things. Moreover, man permits himself to be deceived in his dreams every night of his life. His moral sentiment does not even make an attempt to prevent this, whereas there are supposed to be men who have stopped snoring through sheer willpower. What does man actually know about himself? Before I continue, you may know this idea of deception, self-deception, error, the possible impossibility of a pure drive for truth, and even the problem of dreams, themes, for example, of many different writings, but of Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, where he asks the question, maybe everything that I'm experiencing right now, everything that I believe I see and believe I know is the result of deception, that I'm being deceived by an evil demon, by a lying God, and that I can't trust anything. I have no basis on which to believe that I have any access to truth whatsoever. And then gradually over the course of the Meditations, Descartes establishes in his view the idea that God cannot deceive, and that therefore the things that for the most part we think we know, we do know. So the issue of the intellect's ability to know, the role of deception and all of that, very much Nietzsche's not speaking out of the blue here. There's a long tradition that he's referring to and distancing himself from. What does man actually know about himself? Is he indeed ever able to perceive himself completely, as if laid out in a lighted display case? Does not nature conceal most things from him, even concerning his own body, in order to confine and lock him within a proud, deceptive consciousness, aloof from the coils of the bowels, the rapid flow of the bloodstream, and the intricate quivering of the fibers? She threw away the key, and woe to that fatal curiosity which might one day have the power to peer out and down through a crack in the chamber of consciousness, and then suspect that man is sustained in the indifference of his ignorance by that which is pitiless, greedy, insatiable, and murderous, as if hanging in dreams on the back of a tiger. Given this situation, where in the world could the drive for truth have come from? So once again, Descartes has a different kind of answer to that question. He acknowledges that we know our body and some other aspects of ourselves less well than we know our interiority, our soul or our consciousness. And then, for example, you have in Heidegger, in Being and Time, and the analysis of our everyday averageness, the way that we live every day and for the most part, in our inauthentic way of being, he also says that the concern for truth is not primary there. It is the function of a kind of radical modification. So here we're getting Nietzsche's take on all of this. Okay, how could the desire for truth, the drive for truth have come about, given that nature conceals most things from us, even concerning our own body? By the way, thank you for being here. I'm Michael Millerman, millermanschool.com. Like, share, subscribe, etc. We're discussing this piece of writing by Nietzsche on truth and lies in a non-moral sense. Insofar as the individual wants to maintain himself against other individuals, he will, under natural circumstances, employ the intellect mainly for dissimulation. Okay, not for a drive for truth, but for a kind of weapon of deception. But at the same time, from boredom and necessity, man wishes to exist socially and with the herd. Therefore, he needs to make peace and strives accordingly to banish from his world at least the most flagrant bellum omni contra omnes, war of all against all, a phrase that may very well remind you of Hobbes' Leviathan, where in a state of nature, man is precisely in a state of war, of all against all. This peace treaty brings in its wake something which appears to be the first step toward acquiring that puzzling truth drive, to wit, that which shall count as truth from now on is established. That is to say, a uniformly valid and binding designation is invented for things, and this legislation of language likewise establishes the first laws of truth. Okay, very quickly, just to comment. So, where do we get the drive for truth? When first the intellect serves the act of deception, like a sort of dagger or a weapon. Well, when man has the desire for peace, he forms agreements and contracts in order to enter into a civil state, in order to establish some sort of commonwealth. And as a function of the establishment of a commonwealth or of a civil state, there's agreement as well as to what is to count as true and false. So it's a function of this desire for peace, a desire for agreement, or as he puts it here, a legislation of language that establishes the first laws of truth. In other words, truth is a function, as it were, of civil society versus something natural. For the contrast between truth and lie arises here for the first time. The liar is a person who uses the valid designations, the words, in order to make something which is unreal appear to be real. He says, for example, I am rich, when the proper designation for his condition would be poor. He misuses fixed conventions by means of arbitrary substitutions or even reversals of names. Does that sound kind of familiar? Is anybody doing that today, using substitution or even reversal of names, where something means the opposite of what it means and is being used in the opposite of its conventional way? If he does this in a selfish and moreover harmful manner, society will cease to trust him and will thereby exclude him. What men avoid by excluding the liar is not so much being defrauded as it is being harmed by means of fraud. Thus, even at this stage, what they hate is basically not deception itself, but rather the unpleasant, hated consequences of certain sorts of deception. It is in a similarly restricted sense that man now wants nothing but truth. He desires the pleasant life, preserving consequences of truth. He's indifferent toward pure knowledge, which has no consequences. Toward those truths which are possibly harmful and destructive, he's even hostilely inclined. And besides, what about these linguistic conventions themselves? Are they perhaps products of knowledge, that is, of the sense of truth? Are they designations congruent with things? Is language the adequate expression of all realities? Okay, take a step back for a minute. Why does man care about truth? Not because he cares about what is true, but because he cares about the peaceful consequences of following the conventionally laid down meaning of terms in an agreeable way. Okay, so preserving the consequences of truth. He's indifferent, I repeat, toward pure knowledge which has no consequences. Care about truth for its consequences, not about truth in itself, in this part of Nietzsche's analysis. Then he continues, is language the adequate expression of all realities? It is only by means of forgetfulness that man can ever reach the point of fancying himself to possess a quote-unquote truth of the grade just indicated. If he will not be satisfied with truth in the form of tautology, that is to say, if he will not be content with empty husks, then he will always exchange truth for illusions. What is a word? It is the copy in sound of a nerve stimulus. Let me just pause here and remind you how different this is from other non-Nietzschean thinkers. For example, Heidegger, who said that language is the house of being and who would very rigorously reject this particular Nietzschean formulation about what is a word. What is a word? It is a copy in sound of a nerve stimulus, but the further inference from the nerve stimulus to a cause outside of us is already the result of a false and unjustifiable application of the principle of sufficient reason. If truth alone, in other words, you have a nerve stimulus, can you infer that therefore there's a world existing outside of you that stimulated your nerve in that way, and that you know something about that world given the way that your nerve was stimulated? If truth alone had been the deciding factor in the genesis of language, and if the standpoint of certainty had been decisive for designations, then how could we still dare to say the stone is hard, as if hard were something otherwise familiar to us and not merely a totally subjective stimulation? We separate things according to gender, grammatically, designating the tree as masculine and the plant as feminine. What arbitrary assignments! How far this oversteps the canons of certainty. We speak of a snake. This designation touches only upon its ability to twist itself and could therefore also fit a worm. What arbitrary differentiations. What one-sided preferences, first for this, then for that property of a thing. The various languages placed side by side show that with words it is never a question of truth, never a question of adequate expression. Otherwise, there would not be so many languages. The thing in itself, quote unquote, which is precisely what the pure truth, apart from any of its consequences, would be, is likewise something incomprehensible to the creator of language and something not in the least worth striving for. This creator only designates the relations of things to men, you see, not in themselves, but to us. And for expressing these relations, he lays hold of the boldest metaphors. To begin with, the nerve stimulus is transferred into an image, first metaphor, or translation. The image, in turn, is imitated in a sound, the word, second metaphor. And each time there's a complete overleaping of one sphere right into the middle of an entirely new and different one. One can imagine a person who's totally deaf and has never had a sensation of sound and music. Perhaps such a person will gaze with astonishment at Chladni's sound figures. Perhaps he will discover their causes in the vibrations of a string, and will now swear that he must know what men mean by quote-unquote sound. It is this way with all of us concerning language. We believe we know something about the things themselves when we speak of trees, colors, snow, and flowers, yet we possess nothing but metaphors for things. metaphors which correspond in no way to the original entities. In the same way that the sound appears as a sand figure in those other experiments, so the mysterious X of the thing in itself first appears as a nerve stimulus, then as an image, finally as a sound. Thus, the genesis of language does not proceed logically in any case, and all the material within and with which the man of truth, the scientist, and the philosopher later work and build, if not derived from Never Neverland, is at least not derived from the essence of things. Okay, so truth has this pretension that it reaches the essence of things, and that scientific speech, for example, lays hold of the way the world is. And here Nietzsche is saying, not so fast, in fact, not even close, because from the time that you've had the experience to the time that you formulate it in language, it's undergone these various several stages of metaphorization. In other words, you're at a long distance from being anywhere close to what the thing is in itself, which is what you might think by that, what would the truth be? The truth would be the truth about the thing in itself. But we're too far from that in our speaking. In particular, let us further consider the formation of concepts. Nietzsche now continues. Every word instantly becomes a concept, precisely insofar as it is not supposed to serve as a reminder of the unique and entirely individual original experience to which it owes its origin, but rather a word becomes a concept insofar as it simultaneously has to fit countless more or less similar cases, which means purely and simply cases which are never equal, and thus altogether unequal. Okay, you get the point? So let's say my nerve stimulation gives me the perception of this, which then in speaking I name cup. But unless I'm talking about this exact cup in particular, the one that I'm holding in my left hand, once I start to use cup as a general term, I'm including under that word all instances or cases of cups, and therefore all things that are quite unlike this exact cup right here, or that at least are not strictly equivalent to it. So the general concept cup covers over, as he puts it here, or it unites things that are never equal and thus altogether unequal. But obviously, what's the Platonic, argument that, well, they're similar enough in their look, in their form, in their shape, in their idea, that you can nevertheless distinguish them in a general way, despite their particular differences. Every concept arises from the equation of unequal things. Just as it is certain that one leaf is never totally the same as another, so it is certain that the concept leaf is formed, Nietzsche says, by arbitrarily discarding these individual differences and by forgetting the distinguishing aspects. Okay, in other words, I say cup for both of these cups. You see, I always have a cup of coffee and a cup of water. Imagine that one had a chipped handle. Yes, there would be a difference, but is that difference essential to what I say when I say cup? It ignores the distinguishing aspects, the chipped handle, but is that the end of the story? This awakens the idea, Nietzsche continues, that in addition to the leaves, there exists in nature the leaf, quote unquote, the original model according to which all the leaves were perhaps woven, sketched, measured, colored, curled, and painted, but by incompetent hands, so that no specimen has turned out to be a correct, trustworthy, and faithful likeness of the original. In other words, there may be all these different leaves, but there's the leaf, the Platonic form of the leaf, okay, so to speak. We call a person honest, and then we ask, why has he behaved so honestly today? Our usual answer is, on account of his honesty. Honesty. This in turn means that the leaf is the cause of the leaves. We know nothing whatsoever about an essential quality called honesty, but we do know of countless individualized and consequently unequal actions which we equate by omitting the aspects in which they're unequal, and which we now designate as honest actions. Finally, we formulate from them a hidden quality, which has the name honesty. We obtain the concept as we do the form by overlooking what is individual and actual, whereas nature is acquainted with no forms and no concepts, and likewise with no species, but only with an X which remains inaccessible and undefinable for us. Okay, crucial statement of principle there by Nietzsche, which I hope you understand and can see against the alternatives. To repeat, Nietzsche says here categorically, nature is acquainted with no forms and no concepts, and likewise with no species, but only with an X which remains inaccessible and undefinable for us. That puts Nietzsche on one side of divide of schools of philosophy, On the other side of which, nature is acquainted with forms and concepts. Nature does have a kind of noetic heterogeneity, and so on. For even our contrast between individual and species is something anthropomorphic, he says, and does not originate in the essence of things, although we should not presume to claim that this contrast does not correspond to the essence of things. That would, of course, be a dogmatic assertion, and as such would be just as indemonstrable as its opposite. In other words, he says, we can't say that the difference between species and individual belongs to the nature of things, but we're also not going to assert that it's absolutely true that it doesn't, because we're just going to avoid the language of absolute truth. We're going to avoid the language of insight into the essential nature of things. All of that is out the window. All of that is indemonstrable. What then is truth? So if it's not what Nietzsche had been assessing before, if it's not true perception of the thing in itself, if it's not accurate portrayal in language of the reality and all of that, if it's primarily metaphor and everything else he said, okay, what then is truth? A movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred, and embellished, and which, after long usage, seem to a people to be fixed, canonical, and binding. Truths are illusions, which we have forgotten are illusions. They are metaphors that have become worn out and have been drained of sensuous force, coins which have lost their embossing and are now considered as metal and no longer as coins. In other words, as something natural and no longer as something conventional. We still do not know where the drive for truth comes from, for so far we have heard only of the duty which society imposes in order to exist. To be truthful means to employ the usual metaphors. You remember that earlier, right? Truth was a function of the social convention that forms a commonwealth. Thus, to express it morally, this is the duty to lie according to a fixed convention, to lie with the herd, and in a manner binding upon everyone. I'll just say here again, I've been mentioning the last few live streams this movie, What is a Woman? The idea is that there's no true answer to the question, what is a woman? There's either the agreed upon lies of the orthodox answer or the new lies of the unorthodox answer. You know, there's either the lies that we've taken to be true or the new lies that are trying to establish themselves as true for Nietzsche. Lies on either side, but lies that become a binding social convention or lies that don't. Okay, so you have the duty to lie according to a fixed convention, to lie with the herd and in a manner binding upon everyone. Now, man, of course, forgets that this is the way things stand for him. Thus, he lies in the manner indicated unconsciously and in accordance with habits which are centuries old. And precisely by means of this unconsciousness and forgetfulness, he arrives at his sense of truth. From the sense that one is obliged to designate things as one thing as red, another as cold, and a third as mute, there arises a moral impulse in regard to truth. The venerability, reliability, and utility of truth is something which a person demonstrates for himself from the contrast with the liar whom no one trusts and everyone excludes. As a quote-unquote rational being, he now places his behavior under the control of abstractions. He will no longer tolerate being carried away by sudden impressions, by intuitions. First, he universalizes all these impressions into less colorful, cooler concepts so that he can entrust the guidance of his life and conduct to them. Everything which distinguishes man from the animals depends upon this ability to volatilize perceptual metaphors in a schema, and thus to dissolve an image into a concept. For something is possible in the realm of these schemata, which could never be achieved with the vivid first impressions. The construction of a pyramidal order according to castes and degrees, the creation of a new world of laws, privileges, subordinations, and clearly marked boundaries, a new world, one which now confronts that other vivid world of first impressions as more solid, more universal, better known, and more human than the immediately perceived world, and thus as the regulative and imperative world. Okay, you get it? So at first hand, you have the world of perception, which is colorful, vivid, dynamic, particular, and then you have its translation into the stable, abstract, cool, marble-like world of the conceptual. Whereas each perceptual metaphor is individual and without equals and is therefore able to elude all classification, The great edifice of concepts displays the rigid regularity of a Roman columbarium and exhales in logic that strength and coolness which is characteristic of mathematics. Okay, so the world has become conceptual. Anyone who has felt this cool breath of logic will hardly believe that even the concept, which is as bony, foursquare, and transposable as a die, is nevertheless merely the residue of a metaphor, and that the illusion which is involved in the artistic transference of a nerve stimulus into images is, if not the mother, then the grandmother of every single concept. So what you take as the cool, logical, scientific, mathematical, abstract world of the concept is really just the congealed world of the metaphor. In this conceptual crap game, truth means using every die in the designated manner, counting its spots accurately, fashioning the right categories, and never violating the order of caste and class rank. Just as the Romans and Etruscans cut up the heavens with rigid mathematical lines and confined a god within each of the spaces thereby delimited, as within a templum, so every people has a similarly mathematically divided conceptual heaven above themselves, and henceforth thinks that truth demands that each conceptual god be sought only within his own sphere. Here one may certainly admire man as a mighty genius of construction who succeeds in piling an infinitely complicated dome of concepts upon an unstable foundation, and as it were on running water. Of course, in order to be supported by such a foundation, his construction must be like one constructed of spiders' webs, delicate enough to be carried along by the waves, strong enough not to be blown apart by every wind. A genius of construction, man raises himself far above the bee in the following way. Whereas the bee builds with wax that he gathers from nature, man builds with the far more delicate conceptual material which he first has to manufacture from himself. Okay, we also discussed this theme yesterday in the reading on Progress and Return, where we said that culture means the world of man's making. And here Nietzsche has that even what we take as truth and concept is a world of man's making, not a world of man's discovery, and certainly not something natural, as opposed to constructed. In this, he's greatly to be admired, but not on account of his drive for truth or for pure knowledge of things. When someone hides something behind a bush and looks for it again in the same place and finds it there as well, there's not much to praise in such seeking and finding. Yet this is how matters stand regarding seeking and finding truth within the realm of reason. If I make up the definition of a mammal, and then after inspecting a camel declare, look, a mammal, I have indeed brought a truth to light in this way, but it is a truth of limited value. You see, you're just finding what you put there in the first place, the concepts that you yourself invented, Nietzsche's saying. That is to say, it is a thoroughly anthropomorphic truth which contains not a single point which would be true in itself or really and universally valid apart from man. At bottom, what the instigator of such truths is seeking is only the metamorphosis of the world into man. He strives to understand the world as something analogous to man, and at best he achieves by his struggles the feeling of assimilation. Similar to the way in which astrologers consider the stars to be in man's service and connected with his happiness and sorrow, such an investigator considers the entire universe in connection with man, the entire universe as the infinitely fractured echo of the one original sound man, the entire universe as the infinitely multiplied copy of the one original picture man. His method is to treat man as the measure of all things, but in doing so, he again proceeds from the error of believing that he has these things immediately before him as mere objects. He forgets that the original perceptual metaphors are metaphors and takes them to be the things themselves. Okay, so keep this in mind. Nietzsche is giving us a radical demotion of our drive to truth as something that is completely fictitious, completely false, and very much not as exalted as the man of science or philosophy would pretend it to be. By the way, thank you for being here. We're reading Nietzsche's On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. I'm Michael Millerman. Go to millermanschool.com for my courses and so on. Only by forgetting this primitive world of metaphor can one live with any repose, security, and consistency. Only by means of the petrification and coagulation of a mass of images which originally streamed from the primal faculty of human imagination like a fiery liquid, only in the invisible faith that this sun, this window, this table is a truth in itself. In short, only by forgetting that he, man himself, is an artistically creating subject does man live with any repose, security, and consistency. We must believe that there's a truth out there. for us to feel like we're standing on some firm ground. But if for an instant he could escape from the prison walls of this faith, his self-consciousness would be immediately destroyed. It is even a difficult thing for him to admit to himself that the insect or the bird perceives an entirely different world from the one that man does, and that the question of which of these perceptions of the world is the more correct one is quite meaningless, for this would have to be decided previously in accordance with the criterion of correct perception, which means in accordance with the criterion which is not available. But in any case, it seems to me, Nietzsche continues, that the correct perception, which would mean the adequate expression of an object in the subject, is a contradictory impossibility. For between two absolutely different spheres, as between subject and object, there's no causality, no correctness, no expression. There is at most an aesthetic relation. I mean a suggestive transference, a stammering translation into a completely foreign tongue, for which there's required, in any case, a freely inventive immediate sphere and mediating force. Appearance is a word that contains many temptations, which is why I avoid it as much as possible, he says. For it is not true that the essence of things, quote unquote, appears in the empirical world. A painter without hands who wished to express in song the picture before his mind would, by means of this substitution of spheres, still reveal more about the essence of things than does the empirical world. Even the relationship of a nerve stimulus to the generated image is not a necessary one, but when the same image has been generated millions of times and has been handed down for many generations and finally appears on the same occasion every time for all mankind, then it acquires at last the same meaning for men it would have if it were the sole necessary image and if the relationship of the original nerve stimulus to the generated image were a strictly causal one. In the same manner, an eternally repeated dream world would certainly be felt and judged to be reality, but the hardening and congealing of a metaphor guarantees absolutely nothing concerning its necessity and exclusive justification. So, what do you have? Truth is a fiction that has become well established, in effect. Truth is a metaphor that has become a commonplace, and as a commonplace is treated as a truth and therefore provides a kind of security for us. Every person, but it's the security to repeat of a prison. Every person who's familiar with such considerations has no doubt felt a deep mistrust of all idealism of this sort, just as often as he has quite early convinced himself of the eternal consistency, omnipresence, and fallibility of the laws of nature. He has concluded that so far as we can penetrate here, from the telescopic heights to the microscopic depths, everything is secure, complete, infinite, regular, and without any gaps. Science will be able to dig successfully in this shaft forever, and the things that are discovered will harmonize with and not contradict each other. How little does this resemble a product of the imagination? For if it were such, there should be some place where the illusion and reality can be divined. Against this, the following must be said. If each of us, Nietzsche writes, had a different kind of sense perception, if we could only perceive things now as a bird, now as a worm, now as a plant, or if one of us saw a stimulus as red, another as blue, while a third even heard the same stimulus as sound, then no one would speak of such irregularity of nature. Rather, nature would be grasped only as a creation, which is subjective in the highest degree. After all, what is a law of nature as such for us? We are not acquainted with it in itself, but only with its effects, which means in its relation to other laws of nature, which in turn are known to us only as sums of relations. Therefore, all these relations always refer again to others and are thoroughly incomprehensible to us in our essence. All that we actually know about these laws of nature is what we ourselves bring to them, time and space, and therefore relationships of succession and number. But everything marvelous about the laws of nature, everything that quite astonishes us therein and seems to demand explanation, everything that might lead us to distrust idealism, all this is completely and solely contained within the mathematical strictness and inviolability of our representations of time and space. But we produce these representations in and from ourselves with the same necessity with which the spider spins. If we are forced to comprehend all things only under these forms of time and space, then it ceases to be amazing that in all things we actually comprehend nothing but these forms. For they must all bear within themselves the laws of number, and it is precisely number which is most astonishing in things. In other words, just to summarize this in a word, Nietzsche is saying, we bring ourselves to every act of perception and knowledge, and therefore we can't claim to know what's out there. We can only claim to see the traces of our own involvement in all knowledge. All that conformity to law, which impresses us so much in the movement of the stars and in chemical processes, coincides at bottom with those properties which we bring to things. Thus, it is we who impress ourselves in this way. In conjunction with this, it of course follows that the artistic process of metaphor formation, with which every sensation begins in us, already presupposes these forms and thus occurs within them. The only way in which the possibility of subsequently constructing a new conceptual edifice from metaphors themselves can be explained is by the firm persistence of these original forms of space and time. That is to say, this conceptual edifice is an imitation of temporal, spatial, and numerical relationships in the domain of metaphor. We have seen how it is originally language which works on the construction of concepts, a labor taken over in later ages by science. Just as the bee simultaneously constructs cells and fills them with honey, so science works unceasingly on this great columbarium of concepts, the graveyard of perceptions. It is always building new, higher stories and shoring up, cleaning, and renovating the old cells. Above all, it takes pains to fill up this monstrously towering framework and to arrange therein the entire empirical world, which is to say the anthropomorphic world. By the way, just a reminder, what did Strauss say when he talked about the characteristics of modernity in yesterday's reading, Progress and Return? He said modernity is characterized by its anthropomorphism and its anthropocentrism. And here Nietzsche is saying that is precisely characteristic of our whole understanding of truth. Whereas the man of action binds his life to reason and its concepts so that he will not be swept away and lost, the scientific investigator builds his hut right next to the Tower of Science so that he will be able to work on it and to find shelter for himself beneath those bulwarks which presently exist. And he requires shelter, for there are frightful powers which continuously break in upon him, powers which oppose scientific quote-unquote truth with completely different kinds of quote-unquote truths, which bear on their shields the most varied sorts of emblems. Okay, so once again here, science is seeking a kind of protection. The drive toward the formation of metaphors is the fundamental human drive. Okay, not the drive for truth. The drive toward the formation of metaphors is the fundamental human drive, which one cannot for a single instant dispense with in thought, for one would thereby dispense with man himself. This drive is not truly vanquished and scarcely subdued by the fact that a regular and rigid new world is constructed as its prison from its own ephemeral products, the concepts. It seeks a new realm and another channel for its activity, and it finds this in myth and in art generally. This drive continually confuses the conceptual categories and cells by bringing forward new transferences, metaphors, and metonymies. It continually manifests an ardent desire to refashion the world which presents itself to waking man, so that it will be as colorful, irregular, lacking in results and coherence, charming and eternally new as the world of dreams. Indeed, it is only by means of the rigid and regular web of concepts that the waking man clearly sees that he is awake. And it is precisely because of this that he sometimes thinks that he must be dreaming when this web of concepts is torn by art. Pascal is right in maintaining that if the same dream came to us every night, we would be just as occupied with it as we are with the things that we see every day. If a workman were sure to dream for 12 hours straight every night that he was king, said Pascal, I believe he would be just as happy as a king who dreamt for 12 hours every night that he was a workman. In fact, because of the way that myth takes it for granted that miracles are always happening, the waking life of a mythically inspired people, the ancient Greeks for instance, more closely resembles a dream than it does the waking world of a scientifically disenchanted thinker. When every tree can suddenly speak as a nymph, when a god in the shape of a bull can drag away maidens, when even the goddess Athena herself is suddenly seen in the company of Pisistratus driving through the marketplace of Athens with a beautiful team of horses, and this is what the honest Athenian believed, then, as in a dream, anything is possible at each moment, and all of nature swarms around man as if it were nothing but a masquerade of the gods, who are merely amusing themselves by deceiving men in all these shapes. But man has an invincible inclination to allow himself to be deceived, and is, as it were, enchanted with happiness when the rhapsodist tells him epic fables as if they were true, or when the actor in the theater acts more royally than any real king. So long as it is able to deceive without injuring, that master of deception, the intellect, is free. It is released from its former slavery, and celebrates its saturnalia. It is never more luxuriant, richer, prouder, more clever, and more daring. With creative pleasure, it throws metaphors into confusion and displaces the boundary stones of abstractions, so that, for example, it designates the stream as the moving path which carries man where he would otherwise walk. The intellect has now thrown the token of bondage from itself. At other times, it endeavors with gloomy officiousness to show the way and to demonstrate the tools to a poor individual who covets existence. It is like a servant who goes in search of booty and prey for his master. But now it has become the master, and it dares to wipe, intellect he means, from its face the expression of indigence. In comparison with its previous conduct, everything that it now does bears the mark of dissimulation, just as that previous conduct did of distortion. The free intellect copies human life, but it considers this life to be something good and seems to be quite satisfied with it. That immense framework and planking of concepts to which the needy man clings his whole life long in order to preserve himself is nothing but a scaffolding and toy for the most audacious feats of the liberated intellect. And when it smashes this framework to pieces, throws it into confusion, and puts it back together in an ironic fashion, pairing the most alien things and separating the closest, it is demonstrating that it has no need of these makeshifts of indigence, and that it will now be guided by intuitions rather than by concepts. There's no regular path which leads from these intuitions into the land of ghostly schemata, the land of abstractions. There exists no word for these intuitions. When man sees them, he grows dumb, or else he speaks only in forbidden metaphors and in unheard of combinations of concepts. He does this so that by shattering and mocking the old conceptual barriers, he may at least correspond creatively to the impression of the powerful present intuition. There are ages in which the rational man and the intuitive man stand side by side, the one in fear of intuition, the other with scorn for abstraction. The latter is just as irrational as the former is inartistic. They both desire to rule over life. The former, or the rational man, by knowing how to meet his principal needs by means of foresight, prudence, and regularity. The latter, the intuitive man, by disregarding these needs, and as an overjoyed hero, counting as real only that life which has been disguised as illusion and beauty. Whenever, as was perhaps the case in ancient Greece, the intuitive man handles his weapons more authoritatively and victoriously than his opponent, then under favorable circumstances, a culture can take shape, and art's mastery over life can be established. All the manifestations of such a life will be accompanied by this dissimulation, this disavowal of indigence, this glitter of metaphorical intuitions, and in general, this immediacy of deception. Neither the house, nor the gate, nor the clothes, nor the clay jugs give us evidence of having been invented because of a pressing need. It seems as if they were all intended to express an exalted happiness, an Olympian cloudlessness, and, as it were, a playing with seriousness. The man who is guided by concepts and abstractions, Nietzsche continues, only succeeds by such means in warding off misfortune, without ever gaining any happiness for himself from these abstractions. And while he aims for the greatest possible freedom from pain, the intuitive man, standing in the midst of a culture, already reaps from his intuition a harvest of continually inflowing illumination, cheer, and redemption, in addition to obtaining a defense against misfortune. To be sure, he suffers more intensely when he suffers. He even suffers more frequently, since he does not understand how to learn from experience and keeps falling over and over again into the same ditch. He is then just as irrational in sorrow as he is in happiness. He cries aloud and will not be consoled. How differently the stoical man, who learns from experience and governs himself by concepts, is affected by the same misfortunes. This man, who at other times seeks nothing but sincerity, truth, freedom from deception, and protection against ensnaring surprise attacks, now executes a masterpiece of deception. He executes his masterpiece of deception in misfortune, as the other type of man executes his in times of happiness. I'll comment on all of this in a minute. He wears no quivering and changeable human face, but as it were, a mask with dignified, symmetrical features. He does not cry, the Stoic man. He does not even alter his voice. When a real storm cloud thunders above him, he wraps himself in his cloak, and with slow steps, he walks from beneath it. Okay, so what have we just been reading? Nietzsche's On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, it began by demoting the human intellect. Again, once upon a time, in some out-of-the-way corner of that universe, which is dispersed into numberless twinkling stars, there was a star upon which clever beasts invented knowing. And then, at some point, the clever beasts have to die, and all of this has absolutely no effect on the whole. And therefore, the human intellect looks aimless and arbitrary within nature, a rejection of older views about the nature of the human intellect, which was seen as intimately related to the divine intellect. For example, you could look at Aristotle's On the Soul and the tradition of the interpretation of the active intellect. Well, then you had the idea that intellect has pretended to be interested in truth, in discovering what the world is, whereas the intellect is fundamentally an instrument of deception. Deception, flattering, lying, deluding, talking behind the back, putting up a false front, living in borrowed splendor, wearing a mask, hiding behind convention, and so on. Nietzsche showed how the process of concept formation is so distant from anything that could seem to be related to the discovery of truth as it is, that in fact we have to say that words and concepts have rather a creative function. So on one hand, we use them to fool ourselves, and on the other hand, they embody our creative activity, but usually one that is, in Heidegger's terms, inauthentic, sort of just automatic. Concepts that were once invented get treated as though they get naturalized, like a naturalized citizen. They get treated as something self-evident and something true. And Nietzsche referred to the founding of a civil society or the founding of a commonwealth or the founding of a state as in some sense the origin of the setting up of the distinction between the truth and lie, referring there to Hobbes's Leviathan with the war of all against all. And also that the flip side of that means that when people demand the truth, they demand it for its consequences, for its social consequences. They're not interested in, as he puts it, pure knowledge which has no consequences, and certainly not toward truths which are possibly harmful and destructive. They want truth which is socially acceptable and which facilitates social harmony. Okay, so many other key points in this essay. These are just covering the first 2 pages. Up to the distinction between the man of the conceptual man and the intuitive man, the Saturnalia of intuitive intellectual activity, and so on. The rejection of forms in nature, where he said quite clearly, as I emphasized at the time, nature is acquainted with no forms and no concepts, and likewise with no species. You see that perhaps here on the page, lines 114, 115. And then what then is truth? Metaphors, again, that have congealed, coins which have lost their embossing and are now considered as metal and no longer as coins. In other words, no longer seen as conventional. Okay, a lot of very nice points in this essay, which I hope that you enjoyed. Please like this video if you did enjoy it. Subscribe if you want to see more live streams on philosophy. Share the video if you think you know anybody who would appreciate it. Go to millermanschool.com to see my courses, including courses on Nietzsche's Zarathustra, for example. And I will see you in the next video. Take care. Be well. Goodbye.